Hey, Piero. Yeah, I would call myself a pragmatist. I love William James. I love John Dewey. I'm down with Cornell West. I think a pragmatic American approach to philosophy is beneficial in many ways. But it doesn't mean that metaphysics aren't still necessary because, one of the questions that remains to be answered is how the hell does induction work? How do we gain empirical knowledge? How are specific instances, specific experiences generalizable into these abstract concepts that somehow seem to work? They allow us to move into the future with some idea of how it will unfold. And so it becomes a metaphysical question. How is induction possible? Obviously, it works. There are certain inductive methods, certain pragmatic engagements that we can have in the world that seem to fare better than others. But the question remains, why? How is it that knowledge of one event provides knowledge of uh, another event, a future event, and presumably past events? So induction remains an issue. Practical scientific knowledge about how to manipulate the world based on an understanding of, a predictive knowledge of it. Um, that's all good and well, and it's obviously possible. It takes place. It's produced many technologies that we see around us. But the question remains, metaphysically speaking, how is that possible? Um, what is it that technology is harnessing? Because it's implying that a knowledge of the future is possible. And, you know, while as I've been saying, this obviously works in practice, there are still theoretical questions that, there are still causes for wonder about how this process actually takes place. And we can only explore the meaning and scope of empirical scientific investigation metaphysically. Um, because, as I've said in other videos, empiricism is itself a metaphysical construction. Um, it's based on certain fundamental principles that were not empirically derived. Um, and, this distinction between analytical and synthetic reasoning. Synthetic reasoning being more inductive, empirical understandings of the world, and analytic being more deductive, mathematical, logical, a priori sort of um, knowledge. I think that it's certainly not a false dichotomy. There's a difference between these two types of truth and knowledge, and I don't think that we should, and I'm not implying that you said this, but I think we should respect the authority of each way of knowing. Um, but at the end of the day, they're both part of a single conscious process. What makes us human beings is that we're able to exist in a world that includes both analytic and synthetic truths. Um, we are both spiritual and material beings. Spiritual in the sense that we have ideas and imagination. We have an inner world that can't be reduced to the material world in any, you know, apparent way. Um, we are spiritual beings in the sense that I have an individual experience that you can't ever have. You have your own individual experience. Um, but each of us has this individuality as well as a being in the world, a sense in which we share it, a sense in which we are materially embedded in it. Um, but we're sort of, torn between both of these extremes. Um, and so we do have, you know, in my opinion, a sort of knowledge of eternal forms, but we only realize them in our experience of this material world of change and flux. Um, we can only think in a body, but our thoughts are not reducible to our bodies, nor are our bodies reducible to our thoughts or to our mind. So, you know, to say that metaphysics is so important is not to say that idealism is truer than materialism. To say that metaphysics is important is to keep open the question of the meaning of materialism and idealism without assuming either one is true. Holding a metaphysical position allows you to be in sort of a third perspective that hasn't decided upon materialism or idealism as most fundamental. It allows you to work between these categories. It allows you to avoid falling into some false dichotomy. And so, I want to preserve metaphysics precisely because it's not always easy or appropriate to define myself as falling within any given ism, any given specific metaphysics. Let's preserve the metaphysical endeavor, generally speaking, such that we can avoid having to conform to specific metaphysical systems, like empiricism. I think we can take empirical, pragmatic perspectives while at the same time holding spiritual and idealistic perspectives, because we see that not only are we in a situation where we want to make instrumental use of the world around us, or practical use of, or technological use of the world around us, we also want to understand how we are related to that world, how we can best commune with that world and communicate with that world. And that requires a fundamentally different way of relating to it than the practical or technological way, in the sense that the world becomes an end in itself, and the meaning of truth is no longer that a particular way of manipulating the world provides the result that we expected from the beginning. Rather, it's a way of being in the world that allows us to share our presence with it as something that we are willing to give an opportunity to express itself to, rather than to try to manipulate it in some way into doing what we want. I think that there are truths that can be experienced that don't require that truth having some practical value that can be quantified in any way. So, not that practical truth isn't important. I just want to preserve this other kind of, aesthetic, spiritual, philosophical truth that doesn't need to be proven in any empirical way, because it's not engaging or looking to the world in that way at all. So, I'm all for pragmatism, as long as it doesn't consume our entire attention. We need to be able to hold these other perspectives as well. And so the reason I would want to preserve metaphysics is such that we have this sort of, nothing grounds metaphysics, but metaphysical dialogue and discussion allows us to continually perform this ungrounded ground, an ungrounded ground, where we don't need to commit to any particular belief system or metaphysical system in particular. We can remain in this continual process of metaphysical discussion, and thereby think before we commit, which is think before we act, which is like I said, there's a practical component, but there's also an analytic component, an imaginal component, an intuitive component, where instead of extending yourself out into the world, you retract inward and search for inspiration. Both of these are important, and they've got to be working in sync. So yeah, thanks for the video, and look forward to your thoughts.